Hello everyone, and thanks for joining me. I am excited to talk to you about inclusion and universal design for learning. Let me say that my journey into inclusion did not just start the other day, but it started years ago. As a matter of fact, I taught children in Jamaica who had special needs. I went to UK and I did my graduate degree in inclusion and diversity slash equality. So I know a bit about inclusion. Now, I must say that when I came to United States, I saw something that really bothered me. The issue that really bothered me was that when I entered into conversations with people about inclusion, they would define inclusion within the construct of universal design for learning. Now, I do not like that definition because I've always said to my friends and individuals when I enter into this in-depth conversation that universal design for learning is a component of inclusion. And we cannot switch the principles around, because if we look at inclusion, what we're saying, we're giving access to all, regardless of race, regardless of religion, regardless of physical disability, regardless of all the aspects that need to be considered. Inclusion in every sense talks about breaking down the barriers that can prevent individuals from accessing the curriculum. And if it means supporting sets of individuals to reach a higher point because of equity, that is given consideration to within an inclusive framework. And within the construct of course, educational right. The right, it comes from a rights model too. So we have to look at those concepts. And those concepts I found in UK while studying there, and I hold them very valuable to me as an educator. Overarching notion of inclusion is that all students have a right to have membership of the mainstream class. And the class teacher or instructor must themselves be committed to this ideological position. In addition, they must also believe that all students will thrive. Students who experience learning difficulties and so forth must not be excluded within that class. So therefore, when we look at the notion of inclusion, we must be concerned as it relates to the human rights issue. Many academics continued over the next few years to still define universal design as inclusion. Now, that is just a part of the inclusion process. This thought process regarding inclusion being defined as universal design for learning would change. It changed because there was actually many things happening in our society. We realized that our society was more divided based on what was happening as it relates to race, various groups, and so forth. As a result of what was happening in our society, advocates for universal design for learning started to realign universal design for learning with the tenets of inclusion. The key principles or tenets of inclusion include teaching all students, that is, understanding that students learn in different ways, ensuring that you respect multiple identities in your class, and that will allow students to be creative and engage students in their learning journey. We also need to understand the need to reduce prejudices and understand that there's a legacy of institutionalized inequality in our education system. Furthermore, an inclusive lesson or curriculum promotes social justice. It is also necessary to choose appropriate materials within an inclusive design or lesson. It is also important to acknowledge various cultures and religions in your class. It's also important to adapt and integrate lessons appropriately to ensure inclusion. Another key principle is understanding the diversity in the classroom and know that it enriches and strengthens the student education. Inclusion requires you to understand the strengths of your students and use these strengths to improve their learning. Within an inclusive curriculum, it's important to understand students' engagement, advocacy, and voice. Let's not forget the importance of engaging critical stakeholders that will support the learning process. And finally, an inclusion framework requires a commitment as it relates to inclusion and the processes and ideologies. Therefore, with these principles in mind, It's important that advocates for universal design for learning take these into consideration. And I want to say again that universal design is part of the inclusion process. In 2020, I met Dr. Alicia Mugurdo, who understood the difference between universal design for learning and inclusion. As a matter of fact, she articulated the same position that universal design for learning was part of the inclusion process. Hence, we have presented on this several times. Connected to universal design for learning is accessibility. And accessibility takes into consideration the equivalent experience that individuals must have regardless of their disabilities. And this is done through accommodation. Many institutions will accommodate students based on their needs, and of course, in some schools, students have statements, especially in the K-12 area. You might say, yes, we can use an inclusive design to create inclusion. But I want to say that inclusion is a theory. It's a work in practice. It does not reside on a piece of paper. So if you're trying to design inclusion in, you can do aspects of that work, but we have to be very careful because a curriculum is not delivered on its own, but by those who are going to execute the curriculum. So my question is, if an online instructor is not inclusive in his thoughts, in his deeds, and his actions, how can that curriculum or lesson work if he or she is to deliver an inclusive lesson or curriculum for that semester? The biggest problem I have with educators today is that they intend to allow inclusion to be on a rubric. Yes, a rubric, and I'm saying it because they think if you check some boxes on a piece of paper and you say you've done that in the class, that classroom becomes inclusive, whether it be online or face-to-face. But let me say to you that even in your communication with your students, they will know if you're inclusive or you are excluding them. My fear is that if we use a universal design for learning and suggest that it's going to lead to inclusion, we are practically detracting from the aspect of inclusion. We have to ask ourselves when designing, why are people excluded? And we have to understand theoretical perspectives. I know that the issue of critical theory has come under fire, and that's why many individuals may be taking this approach. Notwithstanding, have you thought about why individuals are excluded from lessons? I'm not saying you're going to learn all the principles and all the theories. That's not going to be possible. Inclusion is a work in progress. Actually, I have heard people saying we can have a total inclusive curriculum or lesson. That's far from the truth. The reality is our curriculum or lesson are always influenced by our own perspectives as well as others. And let me bring another issue to the forefront, and that's the issue of differentiated instructions. When we look at differentiated instructions, we are saying to ourselves the curriculum is there, and now the teacher who is presenting that content needs to differentiate, needs to consider the content, needs to consider the process, and of course the assessment. And within that context, you're trying to differentiate to ensure that everyone is included in that lesson. Now, I'm saying this too because if we think about universal design, we sometimes move away from the process of thinking about one-to-one instructions. And I'm saying to you that when you think and you consider an inclusive agenda or framework for teaching, it brings the point of individuals at some point needing one-to-one help. Now, and that's why I go back to the point, we need to look from an inclusive framework to ensure that these elements are connected to ensure that no person is left behind in your lesson. In summary, universal design for learning is a component of the inclusion process, and that's where we need to start from. So therefore, we have to critically reflect on what needs to be done. How is this possible to move forward? You have to have an understanding of the key components of inclusion, and then you can design. Without that knowledge, How are you going to design something that is going to be inclusive if you do not understand the principles of inclusion? So I'm saying to you, as educators, academics, program planners, and also instructional designers, think carefully. Think and read and implement the principles of inclusive education, and that will help your design process. Thanks for listening, and thanks for sharing the content too, because I hope you share the content